Welcome to my channel. This is where history breathes, and together we step into the past. Today we will delve into one of the darkest and most influential periods of modern history, the Great War. From the initial sparks to the fiercest battles and the peace treaties, stay with us. Europe on the brink of flames. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe stood in a tense state, ready to explode. The great powers were locked in fierce competition for territories, natural resources, and political influence, and a web of complex alliances meant that even the smallest spark could ignite the entire continent. The Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy, stood opposed to one another, the spark of conflagration. On June 28, 1914, the spark was lit. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. This incident gave Austria-Hungary the pretext to declare war on Serbia. Russia, backing Serbia, mobilized its army, and Germany, supporting Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. Soon after, Germany also attacked France, and in order to reach French soil quickly, it invaded Belgium, a neutral country, an action that drew Britain into the war as well. Grueling battles on the fronts. Within weeks, the continent was divided into two vast fronts, the Western and the Eastern. The Western Front, mostly in France and Belgium, quickly turned into trench warfare. Soldiers dug into earthworks, spending days and nights in horrific conditions of mud and blood. Every assault was met with fierce resistance, making advances painfully difficult. Defensive equipment, mines, and barbed wire turned life at the front into a true hell. On the Eastern Front, Germany and Austria-Hungary clashed with Russia. Unlike the stagnant Western Front, this front was broader and more mobile, with forces constantly shifting positions. Major battles such as the Battle of Tannenberg took place here, where the Russian army suffered devastating losses and was forced to retreat. These battles, with their sweeping offensives, complex strategies, and immense casualties, revealed that the First World War would be an unprecedented and merciless conflict. Consequences of war and destructive technologies. As months passed, the war spread across Europe. More nations joined, turning it into a truly global conflict. Life in the trenches, particularly on the Western Front, was unbearable. Soldiers struggled with disease, lack of food and water, cold, and the constant terror of death. The hardships were so extreme that even mental health collapsed. Depression and anxiety spread widely among the troops. New technologies of war came into play: tanks, chemical gases, heavy machine guns, and airplanes transformed the face of battle, increasing the horror and human toll. Every major clash, such as Verdun and the Somme, left tens of thousands dead and wounded. New strategies, such as war of attrition, meant that no side would win quickly, and that the war would drag on for years. Years of attrition and great battles, 1916 to 1917. As the war dragged on, the fighting on the Western Front gradually turned into a long, endless war of attrition. Neither side had the ability to advance rapidly. Soldiers were entrenched in trenches and ditches filled with mud and water, enduring unimaginable conditions. Nights of cold, dampness, and darkness, combined with constant shelling and artillery barrages, created unbearable psychological pressure. The smallest movement could cost a life, and morale was constantly at risk. The great battles, symbols of horror and endurance. In 1916, the Western Front witnessed massive battles that became symbols of both horror and human resilience. The Battle of Verdun was one of the longest and bloodiest of the war. French and German armies suffered over 700,000 casualties, with every inch of ground bought at a terrible price. At the same time, the Battle of the Somme was raging in France, claiming hundreds of thousands more dead and wounded. Yet neither side managed to make a decisive breakthrough in the front lines. In these trenches, soldiers were not only fighting the enemy, they also battled disease, hunger, and harsh living conditions. Cholera, influenza, and famine claimed countless lives in the trenches, while doctors with very limited resources struggled to save the wounded. Daily life at the front was a mixture of fear, waiting, and relentless pain. New technologies and the changing face of war. With the arrival of new military technologies, the face of warfare changed forever. Tanks, first deployed in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme, demonstrated the potential to break through enemy defenses. Chemical gases, especially mustard gas and chlorine, spread terror and caused mass casualties, forcing soldiers to wear protective masks. Airplanes, used for the first time in reconnaissance, bombing, and supporting ground forces, introduced a new dimension to strategy and transformed the course of war. The Eastern Front and the entry of the United States. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front was also in turmoil. Russia struggled with logistical problems, heavy casualties, and poor leadership. Major battles in the east, such as Galicia and Tannenberg, revealed the limits of Russian power against Germany and Austro-Hungary. Still, the Eastern Front remained more mobile, with armies maneuvering widely, though each advance came at a tremendous human cost. In 1917, the entry of the United States changed the tide. The repeated attacks of German submarines on commercial and passenger ships, especially American vessels, pushed the U.S. into the war. The arrival of fresh American troops and advanced equipment shifted the balance in favor of the Allies and brought new hope for ending this prolonged conflict. War at sea. Alongside the land battles, the war at sea was equally significant. Naval clashes in the North Atlantic and the North Sea, involving warships and submarines, targeted Germany's supply routes and those of its allies. Both commercial and military ships faced the constant threat of sudden attacks, and naval strategy became a vital part of the war. The end of the war and its consequences. The final days and a new chapter, 1918 to 1919. In 1918, the First World War approached its conclusion. Both sides were deeply exhausted, and the human losses were unprecedented. Soldiers, after years of enduring hardships in the trenches, were physically and mentally drained. The collapse of the fronts. On the Western Front, the German army, after its unsuccessful spring offensives of 1918, faced fierce resistance and a shortage of resources. Despite initial successes, the lack of ammunition and fresh troops brought the advances to a halt. Meanwhile, the arrival of fresh American forces turned the tide in favor of the Allies, who managed to break through Germany's defensive lines. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the overthrow of the Tsar led to Russia's withdrawal from the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk allowed Germany to shift its focus to the Western Front, but internal problems and the exhaustion of its army prevented Germany from achieving final victory. The fall of empires and the end of battle. After years of attritional warfare, Europe's great empires collapsed one after another. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German empires fell apart under the weight of internal crises and the pressures of war. Populations, weary from casualties, famine, and economic hardship, rose up against their governments and demanded profound changes. Finally, on November 11, 1918, the Armistice of Compiègne was signed, officially ending the war. Destruction left behind was unprecedented. Around 17 million dead and 20 million wounded, along with immense economic and political crises across Europe, the peace treaty and a transformed world. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles was drafted in 1919, setting the conditions of peace and new borders. The treaty assigned primary blame to Germany, imposing heavy reparations, military restrictions, and territorial losses. The defeated empires were dismantled, and Europe's political map was completely redrawn. The consequences of the war went far beyond politics. Daily life was transformed. Women took on new roles in society and the workforce, and wartime technologies entered civilian life. Tanks, airplanes, and military techniques paved the way for future conflicts. The memory of the First World War deeply influenced European literature and art. Countless books, poems, and works of art were dedicated to the tragedy, carrying the suffering, courage, and sacrifices of that era to future generations. This war not only changed Europe's geography but also reshaped people's outlook, reminding the world, at a heavy cost, of the necessity of peace and international cooperation. Long-term consequences and post-war transformations, 1919 to 1930. After the end of the Great War, the world was no longer the same. Europe and many other regions faced profound political, economic, and social transformations. The map of Europe was completely redrawn, and the great empires collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided into several independent states, giving rise to new countries such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire also disintegrated, with its territories falling under the influence of Britain and France. Germany, meanwhile, was subjected to strict military limitations and heavy reparations, which deepened its economic crisis and fueled political discontent. The struggle for peace and hidden weaknesses. One of the most significant consequences of the war was the establishment of a new international order. The League of Nations was founded with the aim of preventing future wars, but due to structural weaknesses and the absence of major powers such as the United States, it failed to avert the next global conflict. Europe's economy suffered devastating blows. Many countries faced bankruptcy, hyperinflation, and declining industrial production. Infrastructure and cities lay in ruins, and millions were left homeless. At the same time, women who had entered the workforce during the war secured new roles in society, and women's rights movements gained strength across Europe. Reflections in culture and psychology. The war also reshaped culture and art. Writers, poets, and artists poured their horrific experiences into their work, giving rise to anti-war literature and cinema. World War I literature, with its vivid depictions of life in the trenches, fear, pain, and fleeting hopes, offered a deeper understanding of history to future generations. From a military perspective, the war became a vast testing ground for future technologies and strategies. Tanks, airplanes, submarines, and chemical weapons developed during the conflict changed the nature of combat and paved the way for further military advancements. Psychologically, millions of soldiers and civilians struggled with war trauma and mental health issues such as anxiety and depression, leading to the beginning of serious research into the psychological effects of warfare. Seeds of political upheaval and a warning to humanity. The First World War ignited intense nationalism and radical political changes. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution was a direct outcome of wartime pressures and public discontent, leading to the creation of the Soviet Union. In Germany, resentment toward the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of defeat created fertile ground for the rise of extremist movements in the following decades. This war was a stark warning to all humanity. It demonstrated that unchecked national, industrial, and military rivalries could lead to catastrophic destruction, and it painfully underscored the need for international cooperation and institutions to preserve peace. Later generations tried to learn from this experience by building international organizations and security treaties to prevent a repetition of such a disaster. Though history showed that these lessons were not always applied, and in less than 2 decades the world was plunged into the Second World War. World War I not only reshaped the geography of Europe, but also transformed the history and mindset of the world. Millions were killed or wounded, empires collapsed, borders were redrawn, and generations endured suffering, courage, and fragile hopes. This war laid the foundations of modern history, international politics, and social and cultural transformations, and its echoes can still be felt in human life today.